All right, let's get things underway. Good morning and welcome. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm Managing Editor of Australia Institute Press, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first Australia's Biggest Book Club for 2026. We're going to be talking about Australia Institute Press's A Time for Bravery. I'm coming to you today from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. It's sweltering hot here today on this beautiful land, and I'd like to pay my respects to people who have been looking after this place for many, many millennia and who continue to do so. Sovereignty was never ceded. You can register for upcoming Australia Institute webinars on our website. That's australiainstitute.org.au/webinars. And just a few Zoom tips, a reminder that this is being recorded. You can put questions in the Q&A for Craig and Amy, and you can talk to each other in the chat. Just a reminder to keep things civil and on topic, or we'll kick you out. And finally, this is a live event and it's being recorded. The video will be available on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. So this is a time for bravery, clearly. It feels as though we have to steel ourselves every morning when we turn on the radio or start to read through the news, whether it's watching protesters in Iran, starving children in Gaza, the erosion of free speech in Australia, or whatever new mayhem is being reported out of the United States. Each day presents a new set of awful prospects for us to look at. And Australia might be physically distant from some of these places that are coming to us via the news, but our lives, our politics, and our future are tied up in these crises around the world, especially the climate crisis and the disruption of the so-called rules-based order. So what's a person to do? Well, the latest book from Australia Institute Press offers some ideas on the kinds of things that people can do from esteemed public figures. We're not shying away from the big questions today and the bold statements, because if ever there were a time for boldness, it's right now. And the perfect people to do that are contributors to the book and our two guests. So you will know Craig Foster AM as a former athlete, a current broadcaster, and social justice campaigner. He has 29 caps for the Socceroos, including as the 40th national captain. Craig was also captain of Crystal Palace FC in England. He is a veteran of a 20-plus year broadcast career with SBS Television, part of the triple Logie winning SBS World Cup football coverage, and now with Stan Australia. Well known for human rights advocacy, high profile campaigns. He's also been part of the book Fighting for Hakeem and the documentary film The Defenders on Amazon Prime. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, lovely to be invited. It's great to be here with you, Alice, and with Amy, who I'm a big fan of your work, Amy. You did an amazing job at Guardian. I followed you a lot, and now you've even gone to a different level. So I'm delighted to be talking with you both.
It's very kind. And Alice, I think we can just say, and Amy, because I can't live up to those accomplishments. So, hello, I am also here.
Chief Political Analyst at the Australia Institute and Australia Institute favourite, especially for your recent blog coverage of Parliament over on The Point. If you're not following The Point, you definitely should be. So, Craig, let's start with you. Let's start with your essay. As a former athlete, you know more than most people about training, about priming your muscles for competition. And the really powerful metaphor in your essay is about bravery as a muscle. You know, it's something that you have to kind of build up over time and maintain. Can you talk a bit about that metaphor and why you were using it?
Yeah, in my experience in the last probably 20 years or so, even when I was playing, but particularly post-career, um, what I've found is that you can develop the skills, you can develop the resilience, you can develop the understanding of the impacts that you're going to be able to create, and also the pushback that you're going to automatically receive, particularly in 2025, 26, and around these times with a whole host of organizations, who are trying to wind back, a range of human rights and other things. You spoke about international law. It's really under threat at the moment. And so therefore you've got really well-funded organizations who are trying to reshape all of that. And so it's in many ways a toxic environment to be engaged in, but it's one where you can kind of map, what it looks like. You can understand how to calibrate your language if necessary. And the more that you engage in what I would say principle-based issues, that is, this is what should occur, irrespective of whoever are the parties involved, then you develop, I think, the skills to be able to do so. You lose any fear of, what the kind of dividends or the impact is likely to be as well. And I think that's important. A lot of people feel reticent to speak out on various issues because they think, oh, well, once I get involved, this and that is going to happen. In actual fact, most of it doesn't. And the point is, the more that you do it, you just become, I think, much stronger, a stronger force, provided that you are doing it in what I would say is appropriate way, which is where it's just based on, principles of shared humanity. I like to follow human rights, international law. I like to follow the objective standards that humanity has agreed. They are imperfect, and certainly the system is deeply imperfect, but they're the best attempt that humans have made at the moment. And so reform is important, but equally at the same time, we need to abide by those. And most importantly, we can't apply double standards, because that's when we really get ourselves into trouble. And I would say that at the moment, Australia's, quite deeply in trouble for that very reason.
So what I really liked about your essay, Craig, is that you do talk about those double standards, and that bravery sometimes is the personal cost of standing up against those personal standards and standing up for those principles. And you mention, Israel's actions in Gaza, as well as what's happening in terms of the international court and climate change. And that towards the end, when you say, like, even if you disagree, know that if you're ever, being persecuted, it's going to be the people who stand for human rights at cost to themselves, often not knowing, like, the person or the individuals involved, but doing it because it's right. I found that, I think, quite powerful, because I think so much of that has become muddled, and you talk about what we've been told to believe about the greatest democracies in the world, and how these people just uphold international law, when we're seeing with our own eyes that that is not true. And I think we've seen Australia falter, particularly when you consider how Australia responded to apartheid in South Africa, and other, big inflection points in the world, where Australia, despite being a middle power, although we are the 14th biggest economy, as big as Russia in terms of that size, so never underestimate our actual strength in the world stage, we have faltered on that. And I just wondered, like, reading your piece, we so often say that sports people shouldn't be involved in politics, but it's all politics. It is all, and sport is politics.
Exactly.
So how have you reconciled what we're seeing now with with our history and also our response?
Geez, so that's a big question. A very good question, Amy, but that is a big, broad one. We probably need a few hours. But I would say that Australia's really struggling at the moment to find our place in the world. I think we're holding on to an outdated vision of what the world looks like, and, like, who's in control and who's moral and who's not. And you saw David Carney, the Canadian PM, I think it was just last week, right? Who by no means has clean hands. What he effectively was saying, well, look, we've just engaged in these rituals. We've pretended that international rules-based order was a real thing. It's only real when we wanted it to be real. We applied it subjectively. That's obvious to everyone. And certainly when it's come to Israel, Gaza the last 2 years, that has opened the eyes, I think, of much of the world and millions of Australians very clearly. I mean, Australia's saying to Myanmar, and I advocate on all of these, so I perhaps see them even more clearly than most. So, I've been over advocating against genocide by Myanmar against the Rohingya. I've been to the refugee camps twice. The way that we sanction Russia very quickly and do these things, and then we're called on by the International Court to do exactly the same things. And we completely refuse to do so. And then the language changes and all of these issues. And then I thought what David Carney did last week was really important for Australia, because it said to us, look, the world has seen you. Like, the world knows that you are pretending. The world knows that your language is not consistent, and that your approach is not consistent. And so what are you going to do about it? And it appears that Carney with Canada is saying, listen, we need to respond to this new world. And his idea is, let's put aside the fact that he's really saying to the global south and the rest of the world, look, we allowed this all to happen to you because we benefited from it. And that's also true for Australia. But ultimately, what he's saying is middle powers like Australia need to group together because we're now, we've now got China with economic sanctions. They're unhappy with the Darwin port again, and you've got Trump who's just all over the place and anything can happen. So I happen to agree with that. But I think the fact that he's exposed the system that everyone has been, I think, when I say everyone, millions of Australians have been really frustrated by watching over the last couple of years. I think that is important. You said inflection point. I think that's right. So the world is changing very quickly. You've got BRICS, you've got broad parts of the world who now are kind of stepping forward and saying, look, we're not engaging in this anymore. We can see what's happening, and Trump has exposed all of it because he just talk about it. So now is the time when Australia needs to be removing ourselves from any form of violence, any form of racism. It's when we need to start saying, listen, we are completely independent. We'll work with everyone, but we work on this basis. And by the way, we'll just apply these rules objectively. And I think, Amy, the thing about me is, because I come from sport, and I think, where I grew up in the country, in Lismore, these were like normal. I thought this was Australia. I think this is one of the disappointments that we all try and reconcile. I thought Australia was a country that could just be strong in terms of, these are the rules. This is what we bought into. This is what we signed up to. And we will apply them forcefully against everyone because that's how, we can be a fair actor in the world. And also, of course, and obviously you guys probably want to talk about this, but we talk endlessly about social cohesion. And I sat on the Multicultural Council of Australia, and I would say, and I think I think I have enough experience in it to know that social cohesion comes from social trust, and social trust comes from social equality. That's the only place that social cohesion can come from. And so if we're going to apply things, subjectively, then that social trust is going to be eroded. That's just a simple fact. And so if we keep up this pretense, it's just fueling resentment and anger and division. And so, I often go back 2 years ago and just say, look, all Australia needed to do, and we are talking here about Israel Palestine. So all Albanese, like in that respect, I blame Albo, right? Because I say to people, well, Albo put all of us at risk. Like, everyone speaking out is at risk. Like I'm at risk. It has cost me, in a whole range of ways. It's cost all of us. And all we're doing is saying, well, we're just applying the same standards and we don't like genocide and apartheid. I don't care who does it. Right. All he needed to say was, well, this is an occupied place. This is a captive population, and they have a right to resist. And they exceeded those rights egregiously, and therefore they should be accountable for that. That's war crimes, hostages, blah, blah, blah. I think it's super simple. And then all we need to say is, and then the response has also had a range of war crimes and violations that have been adjudicated by the International Court, and we don't support any of them. Like none of them. We don't support. Okay, we might support you, or might, whatever the case is. We do not support any of this stuff. Now, if Albo and our leaders did that, then we'd be in a very different place today. Okay, we wouldn't still be talking about it, firstly. Plus, we wouldn't have the social issues that we certainly have. And we wouldn't have to be pretending that anyone that's against genocide is a bad person. Because like that moral inversion is just, it's not sustainable. And so I think people, Australians are just not going to wear that, right, over time. For certain reasons they might for the short period, but it's not sustainable. So perhaps Albo thinks that in his political interest, he's going to be able to ride through this, and then he's going to come off the back of Carney in 2-3 years, right? When they're in government again. I don't know what the political calculations are, because I don't support those calculations. What I support is human rights. Through that, I support international law because it's the only way to make them real. And I support accountability for all violations of international law. And I support peace through, through, I would say, what a just peace. I support peace through justice and no other way, because no other way is sustainable.
Amy, I'm interested to draw out some of the observations in your essay here, in particular, the relationship between the media and the proclaimed objectivity that people in the media say that they have. Can you draw out some of the relationships here between the world that we're living in, how the political class and the media are maintaining the current status quo, and if it's not too much to ask, how are we going to untangle that?
Yeah, I think I could probably solve climate change before I could solve that one. I think, and I've said this before, the issue I have with objectivity is that there are some things you cannot be objective about, like a genocide. A genocide is a genocide. There are no both sidings war crimes. There is no both sidings climate change. There is no both sidings racism. There is no both sidings inequality. Like, there are some things that are just absolute facts. They exist and they should be responded to as they exist. And sure, you can have arguments about the policy and how you step your way through that, but you cannot just be like, well, on the other hand, maybe you have the right to eradicate a civilian population. That is not objectivity. That is false balance. And Australian media is just notorious for taking false objectivity, making it the sensible center, and then basically saying anybody who falls outside of what we are saying is acceptable conduct is a radical on the left or on the right. And there's a famous, sort of fallback in journalism where, a journalist will be criticized over a piece and they'll be like, well, I'm being criticized from the left and the right, so I must be doing something right. Or you're completely wrong on everything. And that is what has upset people. That doesn't make you balanced. It doesn't make you objective. It just means that you are placing a particular view and saying that this is a fact as it is. And I find it very difficult as a journalist, and I've always struggled with this because I do my research, I look at the evidence, I back up everything that I say. If I'm making a declarative sentence, it has a lot of evidence, facts, and research behind it, and I will often cite that in my pieces. Or if somebody wanted to question me about it, I could say, well, I'm drawing that conclusion from XYZ, which is not something a lot of our serious centrist journalists ever seem to have to do. They can make declarative sentences, and that is that, because that is what they've decided the facts are. And we also in Australian media have decided that the center is whatever these very serious journalists have decided it is. And that doesn't mean that they're objective. It just means that their particular view of the world, the status quo, the center that they're trying to uphold, isn't considered to be biased in the way that somebody like me, who believes in progressive policies based on evidence and research and sees journalism through that lens, is considered biased and therefore not necessarily somebody who can be as trusted. But how am I any less bias than anyone who works for the Australian Financial Review, which is a literal paper of capital? But we never actually consider that in the Australian ecosystem. And there's this idea that any criticism of a journalist must mean that that journalist is, particularly right about how they're seeing something because they're getting pushback from the radicals. And I think what that has done is it's made journalists very defensive as a whole. It's made it very difficult for journalists to be, brave and actually state what is happening. And I think the coverage of Palestine and Israel and Australia is a testament to that. I think that the bravest journalists in Australia right now are actually our political cartoonists like Kathy Wilcox and David Pope and and other of our elite cartoonists, Fiona Kakauskis, who have basically just said this is what's happening. And it's obvious based on the evidence in their cartoons and what they're alluding to that they understand the facts and the research and all the rest of it. But even just doing it as a political comment in a cartoon opens you up to all sorts of attack in Australia, often led by other journalists. And we are not the arbiters of that. We police each other in the media because we act as cops, and anyone who steps outside of what we consider to be objectivity, it gets completely, absolutely crushed down by the institution of mainstream media. And we never actually stop to think like, I don't know, maybe it's not about us. Like maybe it is, we're not doing a particularly great job of covering things here. Maybe we need to expand who we're talking to when we come when we come to write these stories. And I think that there's been multiple instances of that failure. Most recently, the alleged bomb throwing at the Invasion Day protest in Perth. If you look at how that was covered, as opposed to the Muslim men who were pulled over in a car when they were going to the beach shortly after the Bondi attack, it was immediately a suspected terrorist incident when that happened. And I understand that Australia was very much still in shock. I do understand that, but journalists are supposed to be able to tell you what is happening. And so immediately suspected terrorist, this is what's happening. Then we have somebody throwing a alleged literal bomb into a group of people at an Invasion Day protest, and it's a device. It's an unknown device. It is intimidation. It's not terrorism. Police are stepping their way through it. The media is being all very careful about how they describe this man who is, as I understand it from the reporting, white. And all of that undermines people's trust in media, because media is not reflecting the world as they see it back to them. Media is trying to rewrite the narrative. And that, if you lose your audience's trust, that is one pillar of our democracy, and our trust in our institutions just crumbled. And there's a reason why the fifth estate is rising, not just in Australia, but in the United States, in the United Kingdom, led by journalists in the global south who have been doing this for years and years and years outside of authoritarian governments, basically saying, we are looking at the world through a journalistic lens, but we're not going to do it through a corporate lens. We're going to do it as what is happening. And that is bravery in journalism, to actually report on what is happening. Balance can be like, this is happening, here is why they say it's happening. But balance is not, we are going to frame everything through the aggressor. We're going to frame everything through the excuses that are being made. And we are going to say that anybody who is standing up for international law is potentially anti-Semitic, because the voices that we're going to elevate in this are going to have a quote here saying that this is potentially anti-Semitic. We make those choices, and we have done our part in media to break up social cohesion, and we've done it over decades. I think it's just the internet has been maybe, good and bad, obviously. Like, it's certainly done its part to break social cohesion, and ceding the public squares to billionaires is probably not the greatest idea. But the internet has been also a great equalizer in terms of how people can see information and how they can get it. And I think that has also led to people saying, well, that's not actually what I'm seeing reported. And that can be good and bad. But journalists in the mainstream, like myself, have to bear some responsibility for the fact that what we write, say, and report on is not necessarily trusted. And we have sent people to do their own research. And that is dangerous depending on where they're getting their research from, but we still haven't acknowledged our role in why that is happening.
Mm. One of the things in mainstream media that I notice and that others have commented on in the past is how segmented the commentary is. So all of the issues are happening independently and apart from each other. And Craig, I think this is one of the really strong components of your essay, is the way that you talk about the intersections and the poly crisis. So, what it is to be living through climate disaster and to be watching the genocide and seeing these human rights abuses. Can you talk about the intersection of some of these great issues that we're facing right now?
Yeah, so it's really well, as usual, said by Amy. I think ultimately most media serves power. That's just a simple fact. Otherwise, Australia still wouldn't be arguing about climate science, because we would be following science. Like, it's that simple. And so what happens is you get ideological media organizations like Murdoch, for example, but most others also have a very close association with power, and therefore they just perpetuate, the current system because it works. for them. I mean, if you're owning a media organization, you're most likely a billionaire or you're very close to yourself. So it's mostly about keeping society along the same track rather than actually speaking truth to media. I mean, I thought one of our best journalists ever, perhaps the best, and we've had some very good ones, was John Pilger. And John was strong, right? And the thing about, and by strong I mean he was strong enough to stand up to power. And what that meant was, I would imagine if you spoke to him today, he could talk endlessly about the costs to him of doing that. And I think the frustration of people who are prepared to step forward and do it is that the cost is higher when the numbers are limited. So the fewer people who are prepared to speak out, the higher cost burden can be placed on those people. So the more people, change can happen when only a small percentage of an entire country says, well, look, this is just not good enough anymore. We can't do this and we need to move over here. But politicians will very rarely, if ever, lead it. And so that has to come from community level. And that's where social media has been important because it has, I think, provided a somewhat unfiltered access to people, and it has been juxtaposed against an extremely filtered reality that the vast majority of media, are propagating and perpetuating. So I think that's difficult. And in that context, to your question, Alice, so what happens is media also, like politics, they also frame who we should care about. And so what we do in Australia a lot is we reward people, sometimes like me, who say, okay, well, you're doing some good social work and, you're looking after these people. But then if we don't like refugees at that time, we say, okay, now you're a bad person. And then we say, okay, listen, so you're against racism. You're the face of an anti-racism community program all around the country. And we'd like to give you an award for that. But then over this racism over here, oh, you can't speak about that one. And that's just, it's not real. It's not real. It's just selective choices being made to keep certain sections of the population, whether it's impoverished or whether it's First Nations. Amy talked about what's just happened in Perth. So, if that happened to almost anyone else in the country, that would be, I mean, I can't imagine what Murdoch Media would be doing for the next 2 months. I'm a white Australian, so they should be calling me racist now, right? Because we must all be involved in this. And so if you apply the same lens that we've just sat through for 2 months, that this should be a sustained 2 months campaign for, whatever it is, whether it's new laws or, whatever the case. But of course, it doesn't happen. So again, it's selective outrage, selective application, it's inequality. And so what human rights advocates do, and the reason that I like to work through that frame is because the only frame I've found that actually is genuinely consistent, objective and equal. That's why. And I believe in people's general freedoms and they have religious freedom, but I think what's beautiful in Australia as a secular country is that you can support your own religion. However, that you can't support it in a way that cuts across the basic rights of others. So you can't discriminate against them. So I think many of these things, are very, very precious in Australia. But I also happen to think that much of the ills of the world come from multiple, if not all, religions. So Australia has a big conversation about religion itself, but the problem again is that we don't want to talk about some religions, we only want to talk about others. So, it's not a real conversation. And therefore, what happens, I've seen this in the refugee space. In the refugee space, because the far right says, well, all refugees are criminals, the far left has to say, no, they're all pure. And we know that neither is correct. So we're not able to just have genuine conversations in Australia anymore. It's just an outrage cycle. Now that helps social media oligarchs. It also, helps, I think, the political class to probably maintain, to keep everyone focused on those things. But I just wish we could actually have real conversations in Australia where we just say, okay, let's have a chat about all religion. I mean, I was just over there at the refugee camp in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. There's 1.2 million Rohingya. Okay, do you know who's committing genocide against the Rohingya? Is in Myanmar, right? Do you know what religion those people are in Myanmar? So the people who are actually genociding what happens to be a Muslim population, they're Buddhist. So I went there like a couple of years ago and then went there again recently. And I was saying they're Buddhist. So you're telling me that now Buddhists are slaughtering and just doing horrific stuff to a stateless population? Yeah, that's right. So extremism and supremacy and violence exist everywhere. They exist in every religion. They exist all around the world. And my question to Australia and to Albo is, are we gonna really genuinely stand against all of them or not? Right. And if we're going to do that, we just have to draw a line and we just say, listen, this is Australia. Like we love our multicultural nature here and everyone is equal, but everyone has like really serious responsibilities as well to ensure that, we're not supporting any of these elements. Now, you can't support them here and then not support them abroad, and you can't support them abroad and then not, and then say that we're against them here. Like the whole thing is crazy. And so,
Yeah.
human rights people who see this and advocate against all countries and so on, like they're just pulling their hair out around the country. It's a very difficult time because it's just crazed. Okay. And
I think
yeah, go on.
yeah, yeah, I was just going to say, I think a part of the problem from the media perspective there is also people assume that journalists are experts and
Mm.
know things. Journalists don't. Journalists are very rarely experts. There's a couple of experts in Australia. I would say that Rick Morton is an expert on inequality issues and governance. There's a couple of other experts in terms of workplace relations. NITV has experts in First Nations. But mostly, dog's body journalists are not experts and they do not understand history. They understand the narrative of that organization or they understand the narrative of the press gallery in politics, but they do not understand actual history or the issue. So, I mean, if it's a surprise to find that Buddhists are carrying out a genocide against people, you can go back to India and see what happened between Buddhists and Hindus, like over that time. None of this is new, but it's new to a lot of journalists. And you can see that in so many ways, like even the way that we cover inflation. So Australia has recently seen like a slight bump in its monthly inflation. It's gone up to 3.8, and it's panic stations across the media scaring people into saying, okay, well, there's going to have to be a rate rise and this is going to have to, force the RBA to rethink all these things, and Jim Chalmers is under pressure. When you look at the data, that interest rate bump came because of travel and holidays over December when we go traveling and go on holidays. And I don't know, there was a little sporting tournament here called the Ashes, which was sold out across the country, where a lot of people came and spent money at these events. And that is accounting for about 98% of the bump in inflation. But that nuance is not covered in Australian media. I mean, I read today somebody writing that the Liberals need to take a leaf out of John Howard's book and stand up against Pauline Hanson. If anyone can tell me in the 30-year history of John Howard's leadership over the Liberals, when he actually stood up to Pauline Hanson, I would really love to see it because, he put them last for tactical reasons, but he embraced Pauline Hanson and her policies and outflanked Pauline Hanson. He never actually stood up to her. In fact, he did the opposite and he gave his implicit approval of what she was saying. And
if you'd like to hear more about John Howard's legacy, you can read Amy Remeikis' new book out. Is it the end of February?
End of February. But it's part of this bravery, right? Like so much of journalism and so many people who so confidently say these wrong things is because they don't have the curiosity or the bravery to peek behind the curtain and go, what is the history here? What is the evidence here? What is actually happening? And often, when we use experts, we're not using the people that Craig is talking to, in human rights. We're not using people on the ground. We're using who's available. And who is available tends to be the most resourced, the most invested in us, putting out their message, and the most media savvy in ensuring that they can basically get around, like they know the language that they can use to get around, things like facts, all of those pesky facts things. And it's created a political and media class that are upholding these myths to ensure that power doesn't actually get challenged, that Australians stay relaxed and comfortable by basically staying clueless as to what is actually happening in the world. And I think, Craig, you were mentioning Mark Carney's speech.
Yeah.
That sent off like absolute ripples across the world. In Australia, we've already stopped talking about it. And I would argue that that speech was basically directed at nations like Australia. And I know that our politicians think that because, what's going on behind the scenes between Australia and Canada over the last couple of years has been strengthening that relationship. But we have just basically just gone, oh, well, a former central banker and prime minister of the country directly above the authoritarian states of, America has basically said the world order never really existed and we've got to stop pretending. And also we need to do our own thing away from the US. And we've just gone, that's nice. In other news, and then we wonder why people are like, I don't understand why these things are happening. It's because of us. We're not actually explaining it.
Yeah, and also, can I just add to that, Amy? Like, of course, you're completely spot on, and but also one of the things that Australians are constantly told is that we don't need to worry about what's happening abroad. In fact, we shouldn't worry about it. And in fact, we can't influence it.
Yeah, don't import that stuff here.
Right.
Like it hasn't already been here since colonization.
Right. And so what happens? So, for example, so if working in the refugee space where, we were literally torturing refugees. I mean, I think a UN Commission of Inquiry stopped short, said it was cruel and inhuman treatment and punishment, stopped short of torture. It must have been very close line. Then, you can see, of course, that the conflicts that we fuel, support, or don't say anything about when we have a responsibility to, as a global actor, don't worry about our size, that ultimately that leads to displacement. And then displacement leads to, all sorts of, violence and deaths and, suffering. And then people get on boats out of desperation, and then they come to Australia. And then we say, well, we don't want refugees, but we never wind the clock back. Okay, no one ever says, okay, well, hang on a minute, let's just go back 5 years or 10 years. Like, how did this actually occur? Where did these people actually come from? So what we do is we're putting up bigger and bigger fences at the same time as we are, if not contributing often, we're certainly not doing anything to stop the issues that are displacing people. I mean, climate is just another one. So, having advocated for that for quite a long time, like I'm very concerned about what's going to happen from climate displacement, which is escalating rapidly. Where are people going to go? Well, some of them are going to come here. So what are we going to do then? And I can't even imagine, what sections of the media, particularly Murdoch, how they're going to use that. Right. So all of a sudden, all these people are now coming to take our whatever they're coming to take. And what that means is, you've got mass potential there for extreme racism, nativism, nationalism, which we're already seeing on the rise. Now, I don't know how far this is away, but these are real possibilities. So these are the conversations that Australia needs to be having. And then, so there's 2 points. What we often say is, well, we're just a small country and we can't be involved, but we are actively involved. So let's just deal with Israel and Palestine again. So, what's happened is, I mean, I think perhaps the most pertinent comment was by, after the horrific shootings of Bondi, Malcolm Turnbull, former Prime Minister, came out and said, oh, well, we don't want these things here. You would say, well, okay, well, that's a comment that you often hear in Australia. And yet over the last 2 years, there's one section of Australians who have been actually protesting, putting themselves in some way, at a cost to themselves, because they've been censored, they've been attacked, they've been, they've been blamed, right? those people were effectively our early warning system, because they were saying, we don't want to be any part of this. We cannot be involved in this. Whether it's morally or legally, whatever the case was, everyone has their own motivations. And they were absolutely right. And so what we're doing is and many people were talking about it, we need to stop supplying parts to these jets that are actually, dropping bombs on children in a human cage. So then what happens is we don't stop that. Even when the International Court tells us you have to stop it. And Australians are screaming, we have to stop it. And then what happens is we get violence here. And then Malcolm Turnbull, a former PM, said, oh, we don't want this imported here. Well, you imported it. Okay, you are actually, like, did you do something to stop it? I don't recall you saying that we have to remove ourselves from this type of mass violence. Doesn't matter who, who perpetuates it. So that's the problem. And then, we don't dive deeper. And so, just these glib comments leaves us vulnerable as a country, in my personal view, because we're actively involved in these things. And then the long-term consequence can be very serious for our whole society. As I said, when people start coming and we end up with a whole 2001 again, and now we've got a Tampa again, and now we've got, really serious issues. As my cat is in full agreement, which I'm happy to see.
Yeah, well, I mean, I get just on the point of history and Malcolm Turnbull. Some people watching may remember that it was Malcolm Turnbull's government. Oh my God, hello, who said that they wanted to make Australia a top 10 arms dealer. That was the goal of Australia under that government. And it was, a bit flash in the pan. And Christopher Pyne and others who led that policy are now working within the military industrial complex across the world. We have several, MPs and former ministers who work in lobbying for defence contracts and things. And that is because Australia is well on its way to becoming a major arms manufacturer. And we don't talk about that. We just kind of assume, oh, it's not something that we do in this peace-loving nation where we actually banned guns. Yeah, but our government policy is to make us a top 10 arms dealer. And that is terrifying, how few people actually understand that is the role of Australia.
Yeah. I feel terrible for interrupting you, but we have so many excellent questions, so we need to get to some of those now. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, pop it in the Q&A box, and if you like someone else's, please give it an upvote, because I definitely won't be able to get through them all. We have one from Christine Klugman, who asks, Craig, would a Human Rights Act help people trust social cohesion and equity? And is that a brave action Albo could take?
Yeah, well, you know what? There's not a lot of bravery in Australia at the moment, which is why the book is very well timed. And I don't think Albo has displayed much, really, if any. I think he should have been much, much stronger on behalf of what Australia should represent. That's just simple. And yes, we need a Human Rights Act. The reason we do is because, for the love of God, for all of us, it would stop a lot of these culture wars and just the carry on that we're subject to every day, because people would just have basic rights. So we don't even have to argue about them, right? And then, for example, you'd have basic access to housing. Okay, instead of just this constant argument about how much it's going to cost and so on. And this is where Australia Institute's been so very, very important, because you've certainly, I think, educated, I would imagine, the young generation, the next generation, very well, and a lot of us, also older Australians, about, our gas, our free giveaways, the lack of taxation, our improper way that we've essentially given away much of our resources. And, that has implications for these basic rights. So, food for everyone, housing for everyone, free school for everyone. I would have thought free university was a no-brainer. You want the most intelligent country that you possibly can have. That's just really simple. So these should be, and every time I go on toll roads in Sydney, I just shake my head for the kids, for my kids and for everyone. I just think this is crazy. We've been taught that we have to pay for all these things. And as you are proving, we're minting billionaires frequently with our resources, which is basically, the ground that, every Australian owns. I just think it's in many ways insane. So a Human Rights Act would, I think, give some just basic protections for Indigenous Australians as well. It would raise the age of criminal responsibility, for example, which overwhelmingly impacts Indigenous kids. So what you would see is some fundamental changes without all of the argumentation, which is why a lot of sections of politics, of course, will oppose a Human Rights Act, because it just basically says everyone has to have this minimum level of dignity. That's my personal belief. That's my own value system. I think every Australian should have absolute minimum. And it's great if you want to work hard and get more for yourself, but everyone has a right to a certain element. And if you're taking it at their expense, that's wrong. I don't care how good a work you're doing. You cannot prosper in life at the expense of other Australians, whether First Nations or otherwise. We just embed that into our society. I think we become much fairer. I think we give everyone an equal opportunity as well, which we're not currently doing. And that becomes part of our national ethos. I think at the moment, like I said before, I think we're hanging on as there's a change of system. We're hanging on for dear life to an old idea about what Australia is in the world. I feel like we're trying to emerge as a country, almost like a chrysalis or something. I feel like we were so close to actually being able to engage and embrace our First Nations, finally. I felt we were anyway. And once we do that, and once we deal with our history, I think that it's going to put us in a position where we can just be, much more humane. And I think we are capable of that as a country. I think there's huge sections of the Australian population who just want us to be better as a country, but there's some fundamental things that we have to do, and that's the way we treat everyone in this country and the way we treat everyone else around the world.
I'm probably a bit more of a skeptic because I've seen, states that do have human rights acts like Queensland, they just suspend it whenever they want to break the Human Rights Act. We suspended the Racial Discrimination Act when we did the intervention. And so I think Australia does need a Human Rights Act. I think Australia does need a Bill of Rights, but I think that it needs to be a social contract that builds it, because Australia does not rise up when these rights are being taken away from others. And governments know that. So they just go, oh, we're suspending it. And there's a small amount of outrage from the human rights sector and from advocates for the group. And everyone else just goes, okay, well, it doesn't actually impact me, so that's fine. And so a Human Rights Act is only as strong as the population that upholds it. And Australia has a track record of turning away from people unless they feel personally invested in it.
That's great.
Yeah, and we're watching with interest what's happening with protest in New South Wales, for example. We have a question from Gavin Miller, who says, in regards to Amy's critique of journalism in Australia, how do we get more readers reading The Point and other great independent media and less focus on mainstream media? What have you got, Amy?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because that's everyone's choice, right? And a lot of it is habit. But I know that under 40s are not doing what was the expected way of consuming media, which is the idea that everyone just kind of turns 27, 29, and then suddenly switches on to, reading the Sydney Morning Herald or reading The Guardian or watching the ABC. That's not happening with younger generations. They're digital natives. They've always been taught to get their information from social media. It's easier for them to engage with the fifth estate than it is for older people who have to break the habit of opening up, the different tabs or apps on their phone. So the way that you get more people to read it is to just read what you think is speaking to you, read to what you think is actively showing you what the world is, and then sharing that on your own networks, because it comes down to human behavior and you can't force anyone to change these habits. Media is certainly not going to embrace new media and say, hey guys, you should definitely pay attention to this. And I think that we saw some of that to the response of younger journalists and content creators when they were included in the election campaign. The silverbacks of the gallery were just like, how dare you stand on our space? The buses are ours. It's not the way that it is anymore. So if you want people to change their minds, then just basically put it in front of them and see what they think.
Craig, we have a question from Colin Castles who says, like you, I understand that a while ago Australia had some moral credibility on the world stage and was able to exercise a level of authority. I also see it as significantly eroded. Do you identify a particular point or period at which Australia's moral credibility declined, or an issue that sparked the decline?
We supported, for example, the Iraq War and a whole range of, interventions which now have been proven to be, purely politically based or resource extraction or whatever the case is, right?
And illegal.
Yeah, and illegal, yeah. So, we frequently do that, but I do think the last 2 years has been particularly problematic, is because perhaps social media has shown a different side, and and people are seeing on their phones, the destruction, the death, the starvation and the children, like every morning we were waking up to those things. And then we would see Australia, one of the few countries in the world, just not willing to say that that's wrong. And so that, I think, is not just extremely disappointing, but is very damaging. The rest of the world is watching us now. I just uh, put a short thing out this morning, for example, about this Mr. Herzog, who's supposed to be coming to Australia in a week. Right? So at the very time, like, it's really simple. At the same time that we're saying publicly and constantly that we want to fight against racism, right? And we abhor violence, which most of us do. That's the whole point. That's why we've been calling for Australia to act, because we actually do abhor violence, like all violence. But Australia doesn't. And we've made that very clear. So at the very time that we're having this whole national conversation about actual racism, uh, you're now inviting the head of state of a country that has been found guilty of racial segregation and apartheid. Now, that is the international court. That's not, this is not a matter of opinion. Uh, this is just a simple fact. So, like, are we against racism or aren't we? Or are we against violence or aren't we? Or are we against supremacy or aren't we? Like, can someone please let us know? I would like to know, because I'm being told constantly that, we are against those things. Then I see people who are against them being attacked. Is like, how is this even possible? And then I see us actually supporting them and justifying the reason why, these things should be done. It's completely nonsensical, and I think it's dangerous. I think it's not good for Australia. You're talking about our international reputation. I'm just talking about, like, our society. If some people are going to, like, I don't care which the community is. I don't care where you're from in the world. I really don't care. But if you're upset because we're saying that the international court is requiring us to take these actions, then that's your responsibility. That's not my responsibility. That's not Albanese's responsibility. That's not Australia's responsibility. Our responsibility is to oppose all violence and all racism, and that is very, very simple. And the simple reality is we are not doing that. We are choosing when we want to oppose it, and we're choosing when we want to support it. And I think that undermines our international credibility. It certainly undermines the respect that we have, for our own country. And I think we're just a hell of a lot better. Like, I just think we should be better people. We are better people, and we're not showing it at the moment. I think we should, and I think we need some leadership that actually, has a vertebrate, right, and can say, I'm going to apply these things equally to everyone, and no one's going to stop us doing that as a country. I think we'd be in a much, much better place if we were just simply able to do that. It just shouldn't be that hard.
I promise it's not because I have a book. It's just because I have read a lot of political history. And I think that you can pinpoint the moment Australia became crueler and smaller. And that was under the Howard government. One of the first acts that he did was to take Australia away from the steps towards reconciliation that Paul Keating had put in place. He, embraced the black armband of a view of history. He essentially, somebody who just lionized his heroes, Don Bradman, Weary Dunlop, and the Anzacs, and the myth of the Anzac under Howard, and such a jingoistic nation. He created a false narrative of what Australia's history was, at the same time as telling Indigenous people that they just needed to get over the genocide because it wasn't going to be something he was going to be guilty about. He made Australia crueler in terms of refugees. It wasn't one nation. A lot of his policy was laid out in the One Australia policy, which was released in 1988. And basically, he just enacted that as a slow drip over those 11 years. Tampa, children overboard, all of those were lies, and Australia basically hanging up its international rights and saying we are no longer believing in that. We tried to change laws in 24 hours so we didn't have to accept refugees, which we do under all of the covenants. We refused to ratify Kyoto. And at the same time, he baked in middle class welfare while demonizing single mothers, people who were on the unemployment payment, and he made it exceptionally hard for unions to advocate for the worker by basically slow drip destroying the union movement. He destroyed TAFE, he destroyed universities, he destroyed public health care. And Australians let him do it for 11 years. And so I think that, and we've never recovered from that. We have never recovered from the Howard government and what he put in place in that time. And I think that is the moment where Australia became crueler and smaller. And he only just flopped over the line in 2001. Australians did not embrace him in those first 3 years, but they kept voting him in. Even after the lies of Iraq, even over the lies of children overboard, even after it was obvious that he was making Australia a less progressive and accepting nation. And my problem, to bring it back to Bravery, is that none of our politicians since then, except for a brief blip of bravery from Labor's 2016 to 2019 election platform, have ever sought to address what Howard did to this nation or use power in the same way. And to go back to the problems with media, he also changed media because for so many, again, of the silverbacks in the gallery who cover politics, their idea of stable government came from the John Howard years. And so anything that is outside of that, anything that looks like a debate in politics, anything that looks like maybe there's some dissent within a party over a particular policy that the media themselves don't agree with, and negative gearing, capital gains tax, super reforms, perfect example of that. That is disruption. That is a government in crisis. That is bad government, because their foundation for good government is the Howard years. And we've never actually addressed it. This Labor government is probably John Howard's greatest achievement, because they are so successfully cowed by those years, by that politics, that they still are trying to shape their policies and their reforms over whether or not it would be accepted by Howard's Australia. And I don't think we've been Howard's Australia for a really long time. The children and the grandchildren of Howard's Australia are struggling to make ends meet, can't afford to rent, can't afford to buy houses, aren't seeing wage growth, and are angry, in their 40s and in share houses because of how this nation has failed them. But we don't see politicians catching up to that. We don't see media catching up to that. And we don't actually see the bravery to have any of the hard conversations Australia needs to have, because we just keep tiptoeing around what we've decided is an acceptable conversation. And anything outside of that, forget it.
That's true.
I'm going to take us a smidge over time with one last question. This comes from Kerry Baker, and she says, the new legislation against anti-Semitism and hate speech rushed through Parliament would seem to make the invitation to Herzog illegal, given his comments and support for genocide, plus placing Australian Jews at risk. What were they thinking? Did they really think this would be a popular move?
No.
Craig?
They did think it would be a popular move, but it did. It came in the wake of Bondi. I think this invitation was issued on December 23rd, and there were some very loud voices within some of the Jewish communities. Australia's Jewish communities are not a monolith. Not everybody is in agreement on, on how a government should react. But it was done to appease some of that criticism, and now we have politicians talking about social cohesion while welcoming a man who has signed bombs that have been dropped on civilians in Palestine.
Well, if ever there were a time for bravery, it is definitely now. Thank you, Craig and Amy, both for your excellent participation in our webinar today, but also for your brilliant essays in our book. I obviously recommend it very highly, but get yourselves a copy, buy it for your friends. Now is the time to be brave, and it's easier being brave together than alone. Get your friends involved. Thank you so much, Craig and Amy. Thank you everyone for coming along to our first biggest book club of the year, for your brilliant questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube. And I mentioned earlier The Point, which is a new website where you can get great analysis on all of the most pressing issues in Australia today. We'll see you next month for our next book club. Thanks for coming along.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Well done, Amy.
Thank you. And to you, Craig. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.